My son sent me a text message on a Tuesday morning that said, "Dad, please don't come to the christening. Elena's family isn't comfortable around you, and we don't want any tension on such an important day." I read that standing in my garage in Dayton, Ohio, holding a wrench I'd been about to use on a customer's commercial boiler unit, and instead of throwing that wrench through the nearest wall, I set it down very carefully on my workbench, walked inside, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat down at my kitchen table with my reading glasses and my phone, and I smiled. Not because any part of what I'd just read was funny. I smiled because I had just been handed the clearest picture I had ever seen of exactly where I stood in my son's new life. And more importantly, I had just remembered, with perfect clarity, exactly what my name was attached to in that life. Every account, every loan, every signature, every dollar. By the following morning, my son James and his wife Elena had made 81 phone calls between them. Not one of those calls got answered. My name is Robert Haynes. I'm 63 years old, and I own a commercial plumbing company in Dayton, Ohio, called Haynes and Sons Mechanical, which I built from a single truck and a set of pipe wrenches I bought secondhand from a man retiring out of the trade in 1988. I did not inherit money. I did not have a mentor. I did not have a father who showed me how business worked, because my father left when I was 11, and my mother raised 3 kids on a school cafeteria salary, and the only thing she ever taught me about money was that you work for every dollar twice, once to earn it and once to keep it. I learned the trade by apprenticing under a man named Bill Garland, who paid me $8 an hour and made me resolder every joint I cut until it was right the first time. I learned business by making mistakes with my own money and living inside those mistakes until I understood exactly what I'd done wrong. I have been doing this work for over 35 years, and I have never once been handed anything that I did not earn with my own 2 hands and my own name. What I did have, from the time my son was 4 years old, was a reason that made all of it worth doing. James's mother, my wife Patricia, passed away from a brain aneurysm on a Sunday afternoon in March when James was 9 years old. She was 38. She was coaching his Little League practice, and she was gone before the ambulance arrived. There is no way to explain to a 9-year-old boy what that means. There is no script for that conversation. I sat on the edge of his bed that night and I told him the truth as plainly and as gently as I could. And when he cried, I held him and I let him cry for as long as he needed. And then I cried too, because I was his father and not a machine, and because I had loved that woman completely. And when we were both done crying, I told him that the two of us were going to be all right, and I meant it, even though I had no idea in that moment how true it was going to be. Running a business while raising a child alone is not something that comes with instructions. I figured it out the same way I figured out everything else in my life, one problem at a time, one day at a time. I learned to pack a school lunch that James would actually eat by asking him every single afternoon what he'd thrown away, until I finally cracked it. I drove him to every practice, every game, every school event, usually straight from a job site, still in my work clothes, smelling like pipe solder and copper fittings, sitting in aluminum bleachers next to fathers in button-down shirts who had desk jobs and regular hours. I never once felt embarrassed about that. I was there. That was the only thing that mattered to me. When James was 12, I coached his Little League team because the previous coach moved away and nobody else stepped up. I had never coached baseball in my life. I went to the Dayton Public Library on a Thursday evening after closing up the shop, and I checked out 3 books on youth coaching, and I read all 3 of them over a weekend. And I showed up to that first practice with a clipboard and a plan. We finished second in the division that year. James pitched 4 of our 7 wins. I still have the photograph from our end-of-season pizza party hanging on the wall in my office at the shop. James with his arm around me, both of us grinning like idiots, sauce on his chin. I built Haynes and Sons Mechanical into something real because James was watching me do it, and I wanted him to understand that a man who starts with nothing and works honestly can build something that lasts. By the time James graduated high school, the company had 3 trucks and 8 employees. By the time he graduated from Ohio State, we had 7 trucks, 19 employees, and contracts with 4 commercial property management companies across the greater Dayton area. I paid off James's student loans 6 months after he graduated without him asking me to, because I had built the business specifically so that my son would not carry debt into his adult life the way I had. I helped him buy his first car, a reliable one with good safety ratings, because my son was not going to drive something that broke down on the highway at midnight. That is what you do when you have spent 30 years building something with one person in mind. I want to be precise about something. because it matters to everything that came later. I never kept a running tab of what I had given James. I never threw a number in his face during an argument or reminded him at holidays what I'd contributed. That is not generosity. That is a loan with emotional interest attached, and it is the ugliest way a parent can love a child. Everything I gave James, I gave completely, freely, without condition, because I was his father and he was my son, and that is the only math that ever made sense to me. I never imagined that the same open hand I had extended to him his entire life would one day be used as evidence that I was trying to control him. James met Elena Marchetti at a work conference in Columbus about 3 years ago. The first time he brought her to my house for dinner, she was poised, warm, and genuinely funny in a way I hadn't expected. She asked me real questions about the business, laughed at the right moments, helped clear the table without being asked. I liked her. I told James afterward that I thought she was terrific. And I meant it. She had a good job in corporate marketing. She was sharp, and James looked at her the way a man looks at someone who makes his world bigger. I was glad for him. He had worked hard, and he deserved someone who matched that energy. Her mother was a different experience entirely. Christine Marchetti was not a bad person. I want to be fair about that. She was a woman who had very specific ideas about how a family should present itself to the world, and those ideas had been formed in a world that looked nothing like mine. Her husband had been a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical company. They lived in a large house in a suburb of Columbus. She chaired 2 charity committees and hosted a holiday party every December that, from what James described, sounded like it required a professional events planner. She was not unkind to my face. She was simply the kind of person who manages people they consider beneath them with a very particular brand of gracious condescension that is designed to be impossible to directly object to. The first time I met Christine was at an engagement dinner at a restaurant in Columbus that Elena's parents had selected and reserved. I drove up in my work truck because my personal car was in the shop that week. I had showered, changed into clean clothes, pressed my shirt. Christine greeted me with a smile that reached exactly as far as her cheekbones, and then said, in a voice pitched perfectly for the table to hear, that she hoped I hadn't had too much trouble finding parking for my truck. James laughed a little. Elena squeezed his arm. I shook Christine's husband Martin's hand and told him it was good to meet him, and I sat down and ordered the salmon, and I did not say a single word about the parking comment, because I was 61 years old and I had learned decades ago that a man who responds to every small slight is a man who never gets anything done. But the small moments kept coming. At a family dinner 3 months later, Christine mentioned in passing that she hoped James and Elena would eventually move to a neighborhood more fitting for a young professional couple, said with a sideways glance at the zip code James was currently living in. At a birthday gathering for Elena, Christine told a story about a plumber who had once done work on their house as a kind of humorous anecdote, and then caught herself and said, in my direction, "No offense to your line of work, Robert." Of course. Of course. James laughed along with the table every time. Elena would occasionally touch his arm and redirect the conversation, but she never directly pushed back, and after a while, she stopped redirecting too. I told myself it was manageable. I told myself that difficult in-laws were not a new invention, that families navigate these dynamics all the time, and that what mattered was that James was happy and that Elena was good to him in the ways that counted. I kept showing up to family dinners. I kept being respectful and easy to be around. I kept telling James I was proud of him and that I loved him, because those things were true regardless of how his mother-in-law felt about the zip code of my business address. Then James came to me about the food truck. He had been talking for about a year about wanting to start a side business, specifically a Southern-style barbecue food truck he wanted to operate at festivals and farmers markets around the Dayton and Columbus corridor. He had a name for it. He had a menu. He had a logo he'd had designed by a friend. He had done more research on this than I had expected, and when he laid out his numbers at my kitchen table one Sunday afternoon, I could see that he had thought seriously about it. He needed startup capital. Equipment, the truck itself, commercial kitchen certification, licensing, event permits. He needed $85,000 to do it right. I did not hand it over on the spot. I asked questions for 2 weeks. I had him revise his projections twice. I asked my own accountant to look at the numbers and give me an honest read. When she told me the plan was realistic if James was willing to put in the hours, I sat down with James and I told him I would loan him the $85,000 at a fair interest rate with a signed agreement because I was a businessman and he was my son, and those two facts did not cancel each other out. He signed the agreement. My lawyer drafted it. It included a due-on-demand clause, the same clause I put in every private loan agreement my attorney had ever drawn up for me. Because 35 years in business teaches you that love and legal protection are not mutually exclusive. I also helped James and Elena secure the commercial kitchen rental space they needed to do prep work and meet health code requirements. My name was on the lease as guarantor because Elena's credit history was thin and James's business income was still irregular. I signed without hesitation because I believed in the plan and I believed in my son. On top of all of that, when their lease on their apartment ended and they decided to buy a house, I co-signed the mortgage on a 3-bedroom home in Kettering because James's debt-to-income ratio with the food truck loan in his name made qualifying difficult without a co-signer. I reviewed the mortgage terms. I understood my exposure. I signed because I wanted my son and his wife to have a home, the same way my mother had wanted that for me and had never quite been able to give it. I had my name and my money tied into nearly every financial structure in their life. The food truck loan, the commercial kitchen lease, the mortgage. I did not think of it as leverage. I thought of it as love. The same love that had me in the bleachers in my work clothes, the same love that had me in the library on a Thursday night reading coaching books, the same love that had kept me getting up before dawn for 35 years to build something worth passing on. I was not keeping score. I was not waiting for a return. I was simply doing what fathers do when they have the means to help and the willingness to use it. I found out later that Christine had advised Elena from the beginning to keep distance between James and me. A mutual family friend told me this months after everything happened, quietly, over coffee, because she felt I deserved to know. Christine had apparently told Elena that men like me, self-made tradesmen, had a way of using money as control, that I would eventually try to run their lives through my financial involvement, that the healthiest thing for their marriage was to establish independence from my influence as early as possible. I want to be fair and say that Christine was not entirely wrong, that financial involvement from parents can become controlling. But what she described was not what I was doing, and the solution she prescribed to Elena was not independence. It was erasure. Over the following months, I noticed James pulling back in small ways I kept explaining away. Phone calls got shorter. Sunday dinners became monthly, then less. When I asked about the food truck's progress, the answers were brief and vague in a way that felt managed rather than busy. When I offered to help at a festival event to run the service window for a few hours, James said they had it covered. When I mentioned wanting to come see the commercial kitchen setup, there was a pause before he said he'd let me know when a good time would be. Elena had a baby girl in April, my granddaughter. They named her Rosie. I was told about the birth by text message 2 hours after it happened. Not a phone call. A text. I drove to the hospital that evening with flowers and a stuffed animal, and I sat in the waiting room for 40 minutes before a nurse came out and told me that the family was resting and that James had said I could come back tomorrow. I drove home. I did not cry until I was in my driveway, and then I sat in my truck in the dark and cried for a long time because I was a grandfather and I had just been managed like a distant acquaintance. I came back the next day, as instructed. I held Rosie for 6 minutes. I counted. Elena's parents were there when I arrived and were still there when I left, settled into the room like they owned it, Christine holding the baby with the practiced ease of a woman who had been there all along. James hugged me at the door when I left and said, "Thanks for coming, Dad," as if I had done him a favor by showing up to meet my own grandchild. The christening was scheduled for a Sunday in June, 8 weeks after Rosie was born. I bought a gift. I bought a card. I cleared my calendar. I assumed I would be there, because I was the child's grandfather, and because the concept of my not being there had not yet entered my mind as a thing that was possible. The text from James arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was in my garage getting ready to drive to a job. "Dad, please don't come to the christening. Elena's family isn't comfortable around you, and we don't want any tension on such an important day. I hope you understand. We'll make it up to you." I read it twice. I read it a third time. I stood very still in my garage for a long moment, and I thought about Patricia, and about a 9-year-old boy crying in the dark, and about 35 years of early mornings and sore hands, and a library book on youth baseball coaching. And then I set down my wrench, walked inside, and poured myself a cup of coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table, where I had eaten 10,000 breakfasts alone, and I thought with perfect clarity about everything that had my name on it in my son's life. I was not angry. Anger makes men sloppy, and I had never made a sloppy decision in my professional life. And I was not about to start now. I was simply done. Done being the wallet at the edge of the frame. Done having my name used to hold up a structure I was not welcome to stand inside of. At 9 in the morning, I called my attorney, a man named Gerald Okafor, who had handled my business contracts for 15 years, and I told him exactly what I needed done. First, I invoked the due on demand clause on the $85,000 food truck loan. The full balance, plus accrued interest per the signed agreement, was now legally due in full, effective immediately. James had signed that clause himself. Gerald sent the formal notice by certified mail and electronic delivery before noon. Second, I contacted the property management company that held the commercial kitchen lease and formally notified them that I was initiating withdrawal as guarantor, citing a material change in my personal financial relationship with the primary lessee. This triggered an immediate creditworthiness review of James as the sole lessee, a review he could not pass without my name attached. Third, I called the mortgage lender and began the formal process of removing myself as cosigner from the Kettering House mortgage, a process that would trigger a reassessment of the loan based on James and Elena's combined qualifying income, which, with the food truck still in its early revenue stage, fell short of the lender's requirements by a number that was not small. I want to be clear about what I was doing and what I was not doing. I was not trying to destroy my son's life. I was removing myself, completely and legally, from a financial arrangement I had entered as a partner, and was now being treated as an inconvenience. If my presence was a source of tension, then my name and my money and my credit and my signature were going to go where I went. All of them, at once. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Gerald had confirmed that all three actions were in motion. I went back out to my garage, picked up my wrench, drove to the job, and fixed a commercial boiler for a property manager who shook my hand at the end and said I was the most reliable contractor he'd ever worked with. I drove home, made dinner, watched the news, and went to bed at 10 o'clock. My phone started lighting up at 11:45 that night. James had received the certified loan recall notice by electronic delivery at 6 in the evening, after the food truck closed up from a festival event. I later learned he had been standing at the service window counting the till when the email came through. Elena received a separate notice about the commercial kitchen lease review at almost the same moment, forwarded by the property management company's accounts office. The mortgage lender's formal cosigner withdrawal notification arrived by both mail and email before the end of business day. By midnight, they had called me 33 times between them. By 2 in the morning, it was 57. By the time I woke up at 5:30 and reached for my phone out of habit, the total was 81 missed calls. 44 from James, 37 from Elena. There were text messages going back to 11:45 the night before, starting sharp and accusatory, turning confused and frantic around 1 in the morning, and arriving by 4 a.m. at something that read like desperation, dressed up in exhausted punctuation. James's messages went from "Dad, what is this?" to "Dad, please call me. I don't understand what's happening," to at 4:08 in the morning, "Dad, I'm sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. Please, I love you. Call me." I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table. I let the phone sit on the counter for another hour while I drank my coffee in the same quiet kitchen where I had raised a boy into a man and watched the sun come up over 35 years of early mornings. And I thought about what I actually wanted to say. At 7 o'clock, I picked up the phone and I called James back. He answered before the first ring finished. His voice was rough and small in a way I hadn't heard since he was 9 years old and the world had just broken open under him. And for a moment I couldn't speak either, because he was still my son, and that had never once changed. Not for a single day. "I got your message," I said. He apologized for a long time and I let him, because he needed to say it more than I needed to hear it. He said Elena hadn't understood how far it would go. He said Christine had convinced them both that creating distance from me was protecting their marriage. He said he knew that didn't make it right, and he wasn't saying it to shift blame, just to be honest with me the way he should have been months ago. He said he was sorry about the hospital. He said he was sorry about the dinners. He said he was sorry about every managed conversation and every shortened phone call and every time he had laughed along with something he should have pushed back on. I told him the truth, as plainly as I could manage. "James, I never needed to be treated like a VIP at every event. I needed you to remember that I was your father. That's all I ever asked for, and it's the one thing you stopped giving me." We talked for almost 2 hours. I told him the loan would be restructured on standard terms, but only after he and I sat down together, without Elena's family present, and had an honest conversation about what kind of relationship we were actually going to have going forward. I told him I would stay on the commercial kitchen lease for now, but that I was done being a silent financial presence in a life that had no room for me at the table. I told him I would revisit the mortgage situation once I had reason to believe things had genuinely changed. I also told him something I had never said out loud before, because I had never needed to. I built everything I have with you in mind. Every truck I bought, every contract I signed, every morning I got up before the sun and came home after dark. That was for you. And I never once asked you to pay me back for any of it, because that's not what it was. But I will not fund a life where I am the embarrassing detail that gets managed out of the pictures. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I know, Dad. I know. It took 4 months, real months, with real conversations, some of them uncomfortable, one of them with Elena present and genuinely difficult in a way that required all three of us to be more honest than any of us found easy. Christine stayed out of it, which was, I later learned, James's explicit condition for the conversations happening at all. He had told her, clearly and directly, that her interference in his relationship with his father was over, and that if she couldn't respect that boundary, she would find herself on the outside of a different set of decisions. He told me this himself, unprompted, and I will admit that I had to set the phone down for a moment after he said it. Elena, to her credit, was more honest than I expected her to be. She told me she had let her mother's voice get louder than her own good judgment, and that she had mistaken managing me for protecting her marriage. She said she understood now that what she had actually done was teach her husband to be ashamed of the man who had made everything possible for them. She looked me in the eye when she said it, and I believed her, because it cost her something to say. They brought Rosie to my house on a Sunday afternoon in October. I held my granddaughter for the first time without a clock running, without an audience, without a waiting room or a 6-minute window. I sat in the same chair, at the same kitchen table, where I had eaten 35 years of breakfast alone, and I held that little girl while she slept. And James sat across from me drinking coffee out of the same mug he'd had since college, and we didn't talk about any of it. We just sat there, the two of us, the three of us, in the same quiet house where he had grown up watching me get up before the sun, and it felt, for the first time in a long time, exactly like what it actually was. Home. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, friend. Hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you then.